This is Freshly Squeezed True Crime, a Florida-only true crime podcast. I'm Sue Haley, and before we get to this week's juicy episode, I ask you to visit the website at fstcpodcast.com, where you'll find all of our social media platforms as well as the newest episodes. And also, find us on YouTube, where we'd like you to follow us, subscribe, share it, do all the things. So, pour yourself a tall glass of orange juice, and let me tell you a story. The self-proclaimed Count van Cosel was born Karl Tanzler, or Georg Karl Tanzler, on February the 8th, 1877, in Dresden, Germany. In 1926, Karl Tanzler left Germany, a country that was dispirited and defeated after the First World War, and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, the victorious country that would become his new home. Leaving his young wife Doris and small daughters behind, he was coming to join his sister in Zephyrhills, Florida, to begin a new life. The plan was for his family to follow once he had settled and felt he could provide for them. Because his destination was Florida, he chose to sail on the Holland-American liner Edam, which set sail on February the 6th, 1926 from Rotterdam bound for Cuba, before making the 90-mile sea voyage to Key West and then the final 400 miles north over land. Now, had someone told Mr. Tanzler that he would, in the near future, forsake his legal, real-life wife and steal a dead woman from a creep, he probably would have thought you were crazy. Yet, his memoirs reveal that even upon disembarking in Cuba for a brief stay, before getting on the ferry bringing him to his final destination, Tanzler was already fashioning a new identity, comparing himself to Ulysses. His journey entry states, "I began a bachelor, set out on the Odyssey. On March 1st, 1926, I made up my mind that my lost bride was not among the ladies of the Carnival, and that I would seek my relatives in Florida, drawn by some mysterious force. Because a telegram had failed to reach his relatives, there was no one there to greet Karl Tanzler when he disembarked from his ship and cleared customs at the red brick custom house overlooking the harbor, next to the Navy Bay. Since the last train out had departed, he was left there, feeling lonely and out of place in a strange land. Karl briefly surveyed the town before deciding to walk along the railroad tracks under a full moon that made the tropical night only slightly darker than the day. In the morning, 12 miles from Key West, carrying the few possessions he had brought with him from the Old World, Karl climbed aboard the Overseas Railroad and rode the rest of the way to Miami. From there, he traveled north to the small town of Zephyrhills, close to Tampa, St. Pete, to join his sister and begin his new life. When his wife and daughters, Aisha and Clarissa Tanzler, arrived in 1927, their reunion was brief. It may have been no more than a domestic argument, but whatever happened, Karl walked out and left them there while he followed his ethereal dreams. No doubt they were ill-suited for each other. Doris Tanzler was half Karl's age, was stocky, healthy, determined, and practical. Strong-willed, she insisted once she was in America that her daughters speak only English and learn the way of the people in their adopted country. On the other hand, Karl, 50 years old, was imaginative, impractical, an inventor, a scientist, an electrical wizard, and sometimes an ingenious liar. He's already begun to mix fact and fantasy in the search for his dream lover. Later in his memoirs, he wrote that when he arrived in Havana, he was a bachelor, Ulysses, in search of Elena. In reality, he was a husband with a family. As fate would have it, it was the romantic Spanish song La Boda Negra, the Black Wedding, often heard on the radio, that would play a major role in the bizarre events that would eventually unfold between the German immigrant Karl von Cosel and Elena Hoyos. According to friends, it was one of Elena's favorite songs. The lyrics go as follows. "You must listen to the story, I was told, by an undertaker of the region. A young man's lover died before their wedding. Without her love, he simply could not reason. At night, he would visit the graveyard and think about the days she was alive. His tears would fall upon her tombstone, the tombstone of the girl to be his bride. On a night when thunder roared and lightning flashed, he broke apart the tombstone of her grave, and with his hands he dug into the earth, and in his arms he carried her away by a flickering funeral candlelight. On his bed that flowers covered, he gently laid the body of his sweetheart and said his wedding vows to his dead lover. On her head he placed a wreath of flowers. Full of love, he held her close to him. He closed his eyes as he gently kissed her, and never again would he awaken. Elena Milagros Hoyos was named in the traditional Hispanic manner. Hoyos was the name she took from her father, Francisco Pancho Hoyos, a local cigar maker. Milagro came from her mother, Aurora Milagro, and Mesa she took from her husband when they were married. Of her sisters, Florinda was the eldest, and Cecilia the youngest, and Elena the middle daughter. All three grew up in Key West, and there is nothing to indicate that Elena's childhood was anything other than normal. Supposedly, her father was a well-to-do in Cuba before falling on hard times and moving to Key West to work in the cigar factories. Cubans are known for their love of family, and if you were a fellow Cuban, you were treated like a relative. The chaotic Hoyos household was no exception. Uncles, cousins, aunts, boyfriends, girlfriends, and children constantly coming and going. Loud conversation, laughter, and tears were all part of her upbringing. Singing, and especially dancing, were two things all three girls did well. Attending the dances held at the Cuban Club on Duval, they were popular and sought after dance partners. The hot dances at the time were the rumba, the samba, the cha-cha-cha, a two-step called Tony's Wife, and the always festive conga line. Most of the single-story homes in the area where Elena lived were built around the turn of the century by tobacco barons to house the cigar makers. One thing the people who knew her agreed upon: Elena, with her raven black ringlets of silky hair falling around her shoulders, was very beautiful and the most giving of the three sisters. A close friend recalled her how exuberant and how full of life she was. Life must have seemed sweet as Señorita Hoyos took the bridal walk down the aisle in her exquisite white lace gown on February the 18th, 1926, the same month and year that Karl set sail for Florida. Louis and Elena's courtship, the wedding, and the subsequent months of bliss were her happiest. Making love with the passion of newlyweds, it came as no surprise that she was pregnant not many months after the marriage ceremony. It must have perplexed her that a future seemingly so bright and filled with promise could dim so quickly. First, her pregnancy ended tragically on November the 5th, when she suffered a miscarriage. Her parents and those around her first thought she would begin to look wan, that her poor condition was due to grieving over the loss of her child. However, as Elena's health deteriorated, her family realized the cause had to be physical and not the effects of sorrow. There was but one thing to do, and that was to see the family physician. The recurring cough she developed was heartbreaking because a number of cases of tuberculosis had been diagnosed at the Marine Hospital, and the word has spread around town. In the early stages of disease, the symptoms of adult pulmonary tuberculosis aren't usually apparent until the disease advances to the point where lesions appear on x-rays. Its onset is usually insidious: fever, malaise, and weight loss. At first, the cough is dry and occurs only in the morning. The prognosis in that era was a painful death. At the time of Elena's illness, it was untreatable because medical knowledge had not advanced sufficiently to do much more than diagnose the disease. In Key West during the 1930s, it was the number one cause of death, especially among cigar factory workers who passed the germs from one to another in the close confines of their workspace. Of the various strains of tuberculosis, the most dangerous, and the kind Elena had, was a type called hasty consumption, because it quickly consumed those unfortunate enough to contract it. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, her doctor immediately referred her to the Naval Marine Hospital for a blood test and an x-ray. Dreading the hospital visit and fearing the result, Elena and her husband rode the trolley and then walked the remaining blocks to the hospital for the appointment. Once there, he stayed outside in the waiting room while she was ushered into an examining room where a distinguished-looking gentleman with an imperial beard and mustache prepared to take the blood sample from Elena. Karl quoted the following: "I looked into the face of an unearthly beauty, the face of my dreams and visions. the face of the bride which had been promised to me by my ancestry 40 years before. Elena had no idea of Karl's attraction to her on that windy afternoon, nor had she any idea of fate had in store for her. But he would not stop thinking of the beautiful young woman whom he felt certain was the soulmate he had long been looking and seeking for. Back in my lab, I sat for a while. Yes, it was she whom at last I found in the flesh, and for proof that she really was alive, I held in my hand the little glass tube with a drop of her red blood. It gave me a shock to read on top of the record sheet that it said Miss, before the name of Elena, so she belonged to someone else. Was there a curse upon me that after this search of 4 decades had come to an end, I should lose her again at the very moment I had finally discovered her, my promised bride? Even so, I felt indescribably happy. What, after all, did it matter if she belonged to another? Hadn't I belonged to another years ago? Remember, legally, Karl still belonged to another, who was caring for their children. But on meeting Elena, something fractured, almost as if something snapped. After this, Karl mentally turned his responsibilities off as one might turn off a water faucet. Thereafter, he rarely thought of his wife and children, and his memoirs reflect his lack of concern for their welfare. I also belonged to another years ago is the only mention in his memoirs of the wife he had married and the offspring he sired. He had now fallen completely, desperately in love with Elena. To add to Elena's misfortunes, losing a child and learning she was seriously ill, not long afterwards, her husband abandoned her for another woman and left Key West for Tampa, and eventually Miami, where he became a waiter in a restaurant on Calle Ocho. Though he claimed Elena's illness had nothing to do with their failed marriage, realistically, it forced him to make a difficult choice: stay and perhaps die of a highly contagious form of tuberculosis, or leave and live to love again. Elena was a walking infectious time bomb with a disease that would later claim the entire Hoyos family, mother, father, and sisters. Only one person, Karl, was jubilant when he learns of the breakup. On the German wedding certificate documenting his true life marriage to Doris reads his name Georg Karl Tanzler. I was born in the town house of our family called Castle, but there was another castle, the Villa Cosel, out in the country, and it was there I grew up. This later manor had the reputation of being a haunted house, and the white woman, whom my mother told me had appeared from time to time during the past 2 centuries, was supposed to be my ancestor, the Countess Cosel. At the age of 12, I had a dream, or rather a vision, of a very beautiful girl in a white dress reclining on a ricotta settee, which I painted on a peeve of paper then. My boyish interests were entirely concentrated on electricity, on chemical experiments, and on flying machines, astronomy, in fact, all phenomena of the universe. I had no interest outside of science, music, and paintings. Girls does not exist for me, especially formally, even as I went to university, and I did neither smoke nor drink. Time seemed too precious to me for such pursuits of momentary happiness. Engrossed in science after science, I took at the age of 24 final degrees as Masters of Arts in medicine, in philosophy, mathematics, physics, chemistry, etc., having passed 9 different examinations. If true, Karl was a young genius. However, exactly who Karl really was is unclear because the veracity of his memoirs is simply not to be trusted. Partially truth and partially fiction, they were written by a man wholly obsessed for love of his soulmate, who he believed to be the reincarnation in a young, dying woman, had warped his sense of reality. Did he graduate from university with 9 different degrees, as he claims, or did he learn by reading everything technical he could to get his hands on? The implausible nature of some of his inventions and his tenacity towards exaggeration suggests he might well have been self-taught. However, his fluency in language and knowledge of science led to other speculation. It was during his intense youthful studies that he had a cosmic visitor, the apparition of his wife-to-be. According to his memoirs, von Cosel's meeting with his beloved Elena took place approximately 10 years before she was officially entitled to even a birth certificate. She states to von Cosel, I've been trying to get your attention for quite some time, my boy, but you wouldn't take no. You were too much engrossed in your experiments. That's why I had to use some violence. Look here, Karl, I have brought you your bride, the one you will someday meet. After this first encounter with the supernatural, the Count said he realized how much more there was to learn and discover, how much more there was to be done in search of knowledge. And chart his course he did, Ulysses in search of his Helena, an odyssey that led him to second apparition in Camposanto Cemetery in Genoa. This time he saw a marble statue of a beautiful girl who bore a striking resemblance to the apparition he had seen in his green room. He learned that the girl had been immortalized in stone, had died at the age of 22, and that strangely her name was Elena. According to Karl, it was destiny that led him from Germany to India and later to Australia, just before the outbreak of World War I. During his stay in Australia, over the course of World War I, Karl was kept with other Germans in Australia in internment camps and prisons, supposedly for his own protection and safety because of his German ethnicity. He claims in his memoir that he was, quote, employed by the Australian government as a civil electrical engineer and an X-ray expert. Perhaps this was true, perhaps not. In 1901, if Karl was telling the truth, he began living in Australia. He would have been 24 years old, and that would have been a busy year for the young man, passing 9 different examinations at university, traveling from continent to continent, and finally settling down in Sydney, Australia. His story of having lived in Australia has some credibility. The Count could speak and write English well enough to be understood easily when he reached Key West. In fact, he was fluent enough in his language to land a job at the hospital. His accent, while definitely German, had a British tilt that probably came from Australia. How and when he got there is unclear. As for his account of the time elements, there are several reasons in doubt that he had lived in Australia prior to the war. While at the Marine Hospital, the Count gave the impression that the only time he spent in Australia was the time that he was incarcerated. A co-worker who remembered the Count's early days at the hospital had no recollection of Karl talking about civilian life, nor did he mention that he had ever become a British citizen. She was another impression that the Count was somehow taken there as a prisoner of war in 1914. Well, he may or may not have actually been in Australia before the war. He was visited there, according to his memoirs, by new apparitions of his bride-to-be. He was mysteriously awakened as if risen from the dead by a living hand. Then followed one of the strangest weeks in his life up until then. The apparition stayed with him for 7 days while he went about his routine work in ordinary pursuits, never demanding yet always there. She stood by his bed as he slept at night before vanishing into thin air. However, another version of the truth may be that he was in the German army. He reportedly told Dr. Alvin Verreker that he had been an officer in German submarine division. According to several people, including Tom Hembright, historian at the Monroe County Library, Karl received a monthly check that he picked up at the post office. Its mysterious sources adds to the questions surrounding his past. It could have been a pension for his military service. He was 23 at the turn of the century, 35 at the beginning of the First World War, when he claims he was taken custody and interred in Australia at the Trial Bay concentration camp. He attempted and failed to escape by constructing a ship. He was released shortly after the end of the war, but since he was not allowed to move back to his native Germany, he was instead left for the Netherlands. There he married and had 2 daughters. Later, the family moved to the United States and settled in Key West. If these dramatic memories are at all accurate, one may arise that these intervals of imprisonment may have been triggering mechanisms for post-traumatic stress disorder, causing Karl later agitated mental state and altering his sense of reality, but also his theories of life, death, and spirit. Assuming Karl arrived in Germany 2 years after the Artemis, as he claims, there are 6 years from 1920 until the year he immigrated in 1926 that are totally unaccounted for in his writings. His retrospective accounts of his past neglected to mention his marriage to Doris and the birth of his daughters, or the subsequent immigration. Accompanying the autobiographical account, The Trial Bay Organ, a product of wit and integrity by Karl van Cosel, In March and April 1939 give details about his stay in Australia before his internment during the Great War, as well as his subsequent return to Germany after the war. Many years ago, Karl traveled from India to Australia with the intention of proceeding to the South Sea Islands. He paused in Australia to collect equipment and suitable boats, and to become acquainted with prevailing weather and sea conditions. However, he became interested in engineering and electrical work there, bought property, boats, and an organ, an island in the Pacific, so that he was still in Australia at the end of the 10 years. He had just begun to build the Trans-Ocean Flyer when the war broke out, and the British military authorities placed him in a concentration camp for, quote, safekeeping, along with many other officers, India and in China, who were prisoners of war. Later, he was removed to Trial Bay, to a castle-like prison on the cliffs, and there the work in his narrative was accomplished. At the end of the war, no prisoner was permitted to return to his former residence, but all were shipped to the prisoners' exchange in Holland. When Karl was released, he set out to find his mother, from whom he had not heard from since the beginning of the war. Finding her safe, he remained with her for 3 years, witnessing the chaos that followed in the wake of the war. Finally, she suggested that her son return to his sister in the United States. Diagnosis and prognosis. Karl said himself, a medical doctor, and told the Marine Hospital Administration that he was one. Even though the hospital found this not to be true, they allowed him to move up from position of attending to technician. Another severe scrutiny of Dr. Lombard and the other physicians on his staff, the count provided he was more than capable of operating the X-ray equipment and doing laboratory work as well as taking blood samples. It seemed not to have mattered that he was a German citizen who was working in the United States government facility. I saw her the very next day when she came in for more tests, and this time I took a radiograph of her lungs, which brought me the painful revelation that she was suffering from tuberculosis. From the frailty of her figure, from the listlessness with which she said, I had suspected that much from the very first day. The certainty which now was gains increased my worries, because our hospital was not adequately equipped for the treatment of lung tuberculosis. Yet some way had to be found to help her. A fierce determination to aid her, to bring her back to health, was burning in my soul. Treatment, proposals, and roses. Despite her condition, Elena's beauty had not faded. If anything, her beauty had been enhanced by the tragedy of her illness, a tragedy which rested in the darkness of her eyes. There was barely enough money to get by in normal times. Costly but medical treatment meant tremendous hardships. Elena's parents were in most vulnerable mental state, and Karl not only seemed knowledgeable about her illness and how to treat it, he was charging them nothing for his services. Next, and important to the X-ray treatment, was to build up her physical strength. Every day, I brought her fruit and some of the finest medicinal wine I could produce. I even went to the priest, because he was able to get the kinds of wine for me which I wanted for my sick Elena. Until this time, he had been sending his real family in Zephyrhills part of his paycheck. Before Elena, there was money to spare, but now that she was in the picture, the checks became sporadic until they ended altogether. At the hospital, he said nothing about Doris or the girls growing up without a father. The 21st birthday approached. I had high hopes now that she would accept me as her suitor, as she had allowed me to buy her a ring. I brought it over that day, hidden in a bouquet of roses. I also brought cakes and wine, and we had a wonderful time. As they talked and laughed on the isolated happy day, Karl told her of his deep feelings for her. Her response was rather simple. I'm a married woman. Yes, he left me, and I will never probably see him again. But that doesn't mean that I am not married in the eyes of God and the church. But when Cosel tried to entice her anyway. Don't you want to get well? Don't you want to see the world? I will fly you in our airship myself to see islands and lush green mountains rising from the indigo ocean. Karl, I think I'm dying. No, don't believe that. You're not going to heaven yet. But don't worry. If you die, I'll take you in my arms. The good Lord will take us both to heaven. Let me get well first, and we'll see what happens. Elena's mother's response was quite simple as well. Her mother had a response that stated, no daughter of mine is going to marry an American. It is to be Cuban if she ever gets married again. Karl treated Elena at the hospital where he worked until she began missing appointments and making excuses about why she could not come. Her family had begun to distrust him, and they started taking her to other doctors and avoiding the Count's efforts to treat her. In his daydreams, Elena lived quietly with him so he can give her the constant care that she so desperately needed. He imagined treating her with single-minded devotion and caress. He blamed her parents for the missed appointments, for mistreatments. Elena's condition was becoming critical. Allowing Karl to return and treat her were acts of desperation on her parents' part, only because Karl still offered hope for a cure. The other medical doctors who were actually treated Elena were understandably pessimistic about the chances of recovery. The only medication they could afford were painkillers that would make Elena as comfortable as possible, as the disease brought to her closer to death. This going behind his back, seeing other doctors, made Karl insanely jealous, especially so in light of the fact that he wasn't a medical recognized doctor. It was only natural for him to strongly discourage it. After another of his periodic expulsions, Karl claimed that his beloved and her family had moved from their house on Watson to a new home. Unable to find where they lived, Karl was inconsolable. Once again, according to Karl, fate had intervened. One night, an elderly Spanish lady beckoned to me from a porch of her house and coming near. I recognized her as her family with Elena. "Your girl, she's very, very sick. The family has moved there and there. Elena is now in bed all the time. She needs you, but her parents won't let you come. I will tell you what, doctor, it is a crime. Don't you pay any attention to those old folks. You just walk in there, and if you're still able to, help her. Help her, please. I'll show you the house where she lives." Thank God he had found her again, because it was obvious that she needed him now more than ever. Where there's life, there's hope. He began his new series of treatments cautiously, because he didn't want to again alienate the family. To get them accustomed to the voltage, he first brought over a small inductor box powered by a dry cell battery. Karl's plan was to attack the disease both medically and spiritually. Medically, the little electrical box he'd invented was a warm-up for the bigger and better high-powered, high-frequency medical unit with a glass globe affixed to the top showing current. Spiritually, he sought to elevate Elena's mood by giving her more presence. Nothing was too good for his Elena. When her rowdy family were lounging around, Karl came in to the rescue. "If I must die, all I can leave with you is my body, for I am only a sick girl, so I can't marry you while I am sick, but you will take care of my body after I'm dead, won't you?" I promised I would, and it was the most sacred promise which I ever made in my life. I kissed her then, and laid her gently back into her cushions, and put her feet high as to get the blood circulation back into her head, to help her for her breathing was getting short. This was what I considered our marriage vows. As if by some preordained design, the song that was playing when the doctor entered the room was La Boda Negra, the Black Wedding. The beauty of the melody caught Karl's attention, and she translated the story for him. The months to come would be extremely trying for him. As Elena's guardian angel, he was ever vigilant in his efforts to maintain some sense of order and peacefulness punctuated by his music. Elena's family just didn't accept his ministrations and continuously disrupted the spiritual atmosphere that Karl was trying to desperately establish by bringing in obnoxious visitors. On October 11, 1931, was the date Karl returned from the jeweler's with the ring. Elena's condition on that hot, still summer night in the middle of hurricane season was sinking, and so Karl was aghast when he learned that Elena's dad had taken her for a walk. He pleaded with her not to drain her strength and admonished her because she might have collapsed in the middle of the road. A few days later, October 16th, Karl was fuming when he found out Elena had gone out for a car ride with her father. The Count's intentions were good, but so were those of Elena's family, both with certainty that they were doing the right thing for Elena, that she was going to die was inevitable. From that day, she contracted the horrible disease. From that moment on, it was only a question of what she would do in between then and her death. Her father, mother, sisters, and relatives, knowing how ill she was, were doing what they thought was best for her. Except for the occasional outing, she spent most of her time and days in a small room decorated with the statue of Saint Cecilia and involved with red roses. On Friday, October 23rd, Elena was in a very exhaustive state, drifting in and out of consciousness, perspiring when her fever broke. Struggling hard to breathe, she appeared to have a bad dream. The parade on Duval. On Sunday, October the 25th, 1931, I had just finished my records after the day's work in the hospital and was about to put on my black coat when the brake of a car screeched in front of my laboratory door. Mario, husband of Elena's sister, Nana, rushed in and told me Elena has just died. Come with me, come with me. There was a big crowd around the house. We had to break passage through the people. The moment Dr. Galley arrived, he too examined her to find that all life was done. Karl's grief took the form of anger. He berated Mario for not coming earlier, then blamed the family once again for the inevitable. In his grief, Karl hated Elena's family because they hadn't followed his instructions about rest and visitation, and because they had the audacity to repeatedly question his motives and his abilities. Once again, Karl was there to save Elena by rescuing her from a disgraceful burial. He made and paid for the funeral arrangements. According to Karl, Elena's father introduced him to Mr. Richard, the funeral director, and pleaded with Karl, imploring him to make the funeral arrangements. And he did. At the funeral home, Karl selected the coffin, the flowers, and made the decisions required for the final disposition of his beloved. Though grieving, Karl saw to each and every detail. At the very last moment, when the coffin was about to be closed and everybody was out of the room, I took a letter from my breast pocket and put it under Elena's dress on her breast. Then I kissed her goodbye on her temple, which was the one place which had remained uncontaminated by other kisses. The letter read, "My love for you is greater than ever. You are now free from all your fears and fetters. You are free to go where you wish. Elena, please come to me, sweetheart. I long to touch you. I love you so much. Tell me, what shall I do? As I cannot live without you. Will you have me, darling? Then take me or come to me and stay with me until I can go with you. My sweetheart Elena, your own Karl." The thirst Karl had for this lovely girl, before dead, was never to be quenched. It was impossible for him to stop caring, or to forget her, even for a moment. From his airplane, the Count borrowed a tarp, which he placed over the tomb, securing it with stones. He rearranged the flowers and laid them on top of the tarp. Now it was time to get on with life, but not for Karl. Karl told Elena's parents, "No matter whether you move or stay, I'm going to live in my Elena's room, where she has lived and died, because I distinctly feel at home in her presence." To this they agreed, and from then on, I slept in Elena's bed. It still preserved a sweet sense of her hair, and now seems strange, some say weird, that her parents consented to this, but due to their sorrow, her parents were confused and bereaved. Of course, poor as they were, they needed the $5 a month in rent he was going to pay them. The tarp that Karl had used was only a temporary solution to the long-term decay problem, so he promised to forestall. From the moment Karl fell for Elena, he was perpetually doing something for her, making her concentrated cushions, building high-voltage machines to heal her, taking her gifts, even buying her the mahogany bed in which she died in. Now that she was dead and buried, there was nothing else for him to do except worry about her to protect her beautiful form. But what could he do? How would he care for her below the ground? In a moment of inspiration, he realized that it was his duty to erect the grand mausoleum as a testament of his love and awaited removal from her grave. An architectural monument to his Elena was the next step. The mausoleum and the great escape. During the day, he still worked at the hospital. The rest of the time, he spent designing and constructing the new mausoleum. Because Karl planned to build the ornate crypt over the pit where Elena was buried, he had to get a disturbance permit to remove her body from underground grave. With the Hoyos family and the state of Florida's permission, Elena made her second trip to the funeral home. She would eventually make 3. This time, it was Lopez's funeral home that stored her body, while Karl went forward with not one, but two tasks he felt he had to accomplish. First, he had to construct Elena's new and improved home in the Key West cemetery. Second, Karl thought it was imperative that he secretly, quote, rebed her body just in case there had been water damage. Quote, he wanted to see her again. To build the mausoleum he had designed, he had to purchase an additional plot adjacent to the one where she was resting. Then he found a mason. The construction took 3 months, one for the actual construction, one for the cement to cure, and one to finish the interior. The rebedding of Elena was an extremely unorthodox procedure, and so it had to be done in the middle of the night. Perhaps a little money to the undertaker on the other side for help. Karl gained access to the morgue and to Elena's vault. Essentially, Karl submerged Elena's body in a homemade incubator tank similar to suspending objects in formaldehyde. Later, Elena was placed in a double casket, and according to Karl, there were no ordinary coffins that would be purchased, but made to order. The inner casket lid was fastened with 100 screws and fitted with 2 made-to-order valves. The outer casket, made of steel, was secured by more than 50 locks that required a key. The mausoleum was finished. It looked more like a pleasant summer residence than a burial place. Inscribed a rectangular marble headstone embedded in the cement wall next to the entrance was Elena Milagro Hoyos, born July 31, 1908, died October 25, 1931. R.I.P. followed Count D. Cosel, which stood for Countess Damsel Cosel. Every evening I went for the little house I had built for her. I didn't do this from a plan or any specific intention. I just felt pulled to the spot by some magnetic power, which always increased towards the evenings and had become quite irresistible when the sun set down below the horizon. For 18 months, Karl came faithfully to the tomb, sitting inside on a small chair near the coffin brooding. Thereafter, he began strapping up conversations with Elena. It was rumored that he even installed a phone so he could call Elena when the weather was too bad for one of his personal visits. However, such times were rare. Almost every night he came to see her, her faithful lover, her forever lasting suitor. At this point, Karl felt he was communicating with Elena's spirit and that she spoke to him. Anyone walking down Francis Street by the cemetery, close to the mausoleum, would quicken their steps on the dark night because you could hear him laughing and talking and echoing off the cement inside Elena's tomb. The rumble of distant thunder was a fitting percussive note for what transpired on April 1933. "Do you love me, Carlos?" Putting his mouth to the valve, he replied, "Elena, why would you say such a thing? Do you still love me? Don't you, Carlos?" "Of course I love you. Why would I visit you at night? After night, after night. Tell me then, Carlos, am I really dead?" "No, Elena, you are not dead. Your body is sleeping. Your spirit is dreaming. Carlos, where do I live?" "You live in the little house I built for you. I built it to protect you. I want you to be safe. Is this your home too?" "No, Elena, I come here to visit you." Thunder crash. "Carlos, listen to me. I want to go home with you. I want to be with you." Karl, now being the skeptical one, "You see, the cemetery is surrounded by streets and houses, has several gates, but they are in full view of the houses and automobiles are passing back and forth past the cemetery at all hours. People are curious. They are quite used to seeing coffins go into the cemetery, but never have they seen the dead come out. If they see us, people might raise hell." Before Karl did the infamously legendary deed that would forever make him a part of Key West history, there was to be a dress rehearsal. It was now a mystical night for Karl. He double-checked everything before taking the wagon, blanket, cushions, and broke down the stairs of the mausoleum. A black crucifix above Elena's coffin inexplicably glowed with a soft light as Karl extracted the inner casket from the outer one. This could have not been an easy task because they were so heavy. He then loaded his darling bride onto the little wagon he had purchased and placed rubber cushions on either ends. The blanket with the crucifix on top was tied around the casket with rope, Satisfied there was no one watching, he pulled the wagon from within the mausoleum. Their remarkable journey had just begun. Karl stated a wonderfully elated feeling to complete possession of his entire body, as there was a second spirit had answered his soul. He seemed that a bodyguard of veiled angels had formed on both sides and were coming along with them, and a great inspiration filled within him. He made him feel like a victor, holding the triumphal entry into a world forgotten and buried. I felt secure, protected, and invulnerable. No matter what was coming against us now, nothing can harm either one of us. All the cemetery was alive with the souls which had come out of their graves from both sides, moving and thronging all around us. It was indeed like a festival amongst the party. As they moved all up and down the sides, it was like a great divine wedding march for me taking place. It could not be a funeral march, for all seemed happy and joyful and interested in the silent admiration, watching as the white forms of angels filled past with Elena and me and their midst. They were everywhere, not blocking our way, but all of them melting out of our way. It seems as if they had never seen such a celebration in the cemetery before. It was as if all they were delighted and delirious to help us. The little cart, for all of its weight, seemed almost to run by itself. It responded to the slight of touch of my hands, which gave me the impression of friendly hands reaching out to the ground. He was able to get the casket to the little house he had rented as a halfway house. The following day he decided to leave the coffin at rest. But the day after, seemingly undaunted promises to the dead were sacred, he took Elena from the halfway house and loaded her into a large sedan. Everything went fine. I arrived at the hospital grounds where the plane was without incident. This part of the hospital grounds, being behind the morgue, was quite deserted evenings. Undisturbed, I had moved my beloved into the cabin of this plane. She now had taken full possession of it. There was so much more to be done. Death and airships. Karl kept his promise. Her wish had been fulfilled. Easter close at hand. I made everything nice and cozy in her cabin. Her garments, bridal dresses, flowers and jewels, shoes, stocking, rings, everything at her hands, with plenty of money too. Gently I slid the coffin from the pilot's cabin into hers beneath the little curtained window, which were all screened against insects. There was a tank of distilled water inside for washing and drinking, plenty of cleanliness and sterile cotton. Everything medical had been provided for, including installation of an apparatus with solutions and chemicals to keep her cabin clean. Her cabin was really the hospital of the ship. The only time it was safe for Karl to work on his slumbering love was in the dead of night, when prying eyes will be closed and asleep. The first light of day was approaching as he finished removing the last of the 100 screws securing the casket lid. The next night, after snapping the latch of the door lock and locking himself, he removed the final 4 screws and lifted the cover. I can hardly describe the picture which unfolded before my eyes. It was a horrible and saddening sight to look inside the coffin after 18 months in the grave. It was disheartening. It was the eyes, windows to the soul, which bothered him the most. He had to find a way to replace them. He probably ordered them from a mail order catalog and had them shipped, attention Dr. Karl van Cosel to the hospital, despite the condition of Elena's body to the hospital. Karl, and his mysterious past, had studied the Hindu religion because he believed in Brahmin wisdom. A Brahmin is a member of the priestly Hindu caste, and Brahmin is defined by Webster's dictionary as the supreme and ethereal essence of spirit of the universe. Karl's interpretation of the Brahmin recipe for any incurable disease was to die and remain buried for 1 year, thereby after you're cured. Karl admitted that there were a few problems. The first problem was that few wanted to try this method. The second problem was the chemicals and destructive agencies used by the embalmers preclude any possibility of coming back. Another problem, since there was only one chance to come back from the dead, when the body dies the second time, you are dead forever. For this reason, the initial comeback must be handled with delicacy and caution. Karl's beliefs were the reason he gave Elena's original embalmer detailed instructions on how to prepare her body. According to his memoirs, otherwise, the undertaker would have botched Elena's second and last chance at life. Remember Doris? while cards and letters arriving from wife Doris were tossed aside. He had no time for them. His only thoughts were of Elena. He began making cosmetic improvements that would lead to a remarkable transformation. First, he put splints on Elena's nose that were kept in place with bandages. Next, he had to straighten out her arm, which had been folded across her body in the coffin. Hot solutions were then administered to restore her intestinal tract, but it was Karl's ability to make death masks that transformed Elena in a curious, unexpected, and significant way. To the outside world, Elena was becoming a modern-day mummy. To Karl, she was returning to life. In the meantime, changes at the Marine Hospital were about to unsettle Karl's everyday existence. The commander of the naval station of which the hospital was part of had died. His successor was much younger and refused to allow Karl to continue storing his airship on government property. Fortunately, a place where he could, quote, build his residence, an airplane hangar, was offered to Karl on Rest Beach. Karl hired a truck to pull the airplane and asked, of all people, Mario Medina, Elena's sister's husband, if he could help out. Mario, who had no earthly idea that he was, in Karl's mind, related to him through marriage, agreed to assist Karl, but knew nothing about the plane's contents. When the procession reached White Street, they turned right, traveling about half a mile south, until the road ended at the shore. Several hundred feet to the east of the dead ends was his new residence. Meanwhile, in Zephyrhills in 1934, one of Karl's daughters died suddenly of diphtheria. The death of Crystal saddened Doris and her surviving sister immeasurably. Surely their father would come home for the burial of the child he had fathered during happier times when they lived in Germany. Desperately seeking emotional and financial support, Doris wrote to her estranged husband and told him of the tragedy. After all they had been through, she needed Karl more than ever. However, Karl was so consumed with caring for his dead sweetheart that he ignored the emotional pleas of his lawful wife. He didn't go to his daughter Crystal's funeral, nor did he send her any money. All that he had was for his beloved Elena. He would need money to build their castle on their sands and to care for her. What Karl did to his wife in her time of need was unforgivably cruel, and the mystery of it is Karl wasn't that kind of person who would be intentionally mean-spirited. One explanation, of course, was the phenomena of snapping that I discussed before. He had become so obsessed in his deluded make-believe world that his thoughts and sympathy were reserved for his poor dead love, whom he has sworn to restore to life, whom he has sworn to love forevermore. Photographs of his new home don't live up to his description. The type of building is similar to those on farms in South Texas, an open shed for farming equipment and enclosed room for tools, saddles, or whatever they don't want to leave out in the open. On the left side of the picture is a shed he called the large hangar. On the right side of the shed portion are two pieces of roofing tin he called folding steel doors. At the very end of the shed, on the far left side of the photograph, visible is the airplane. His million-volt transformer and a large X-ray machine must not have taken up much of the small room he and his bride would share. In reality, Karl's new home on Rest Beach was a rundown shack that had been part of an old butcher's pens where cattle had been slaughtered so the blood could run directly into the sea. Not only did Mario and Karl move the airship, he also helped make some necessary repairs on the shack before Karl can move in. And that's the end of part 1. Join me next week for the conclusion. This episode was squeezed to perfection. First Few Squeezed is hosted and written by me, Sue Haley, and executive produced by Ebony. Still thirsty and need more? Visit us at fstcpodcast.com for links to all our social media handles, including YouTube. Want to keep the juice flowing? Make a donation by buying us a glass. And as always, cheers.